What if the most beautiful and graceful young boys in ancient Egypt were not born to rule, but bought to please? While temples glorified pharaohs and gods, no one spoke of the silent victims hidden in their golden chambers. These boys were not slaves, not priests, not lovers. They were possessions, traded like ivory and gold. Their families sold them to survive the floods of the Nile. Priests and scribes trained them to obey, to charm, to serve. For thousands of years, across dynasties and divine bloodlines, male concubines suffered in silence, their beauty worshipped, their pain erased from history. This is the story Egypt never wanted remembered. In ancient Egypt, during the years when the Nile failed to flood and famine crept through the villages, beauty became a commodity more valuable than grain or livestock. As desperate families were forced to choose between watching their sons starve or selling them to survive, temple scribes and royal scouts known as Seshnu began traveling from Memphis to Thebes. They searched for boys who possessed not only flawless skin and symmetrical features, but also intelligence and grace. The pharaoh's court demanded more than looks, it demanded performance. The scouts carried papyrus contracts sealed with temple stamps, offering silver, bread, and the promise of protection in exchange for their sons. Though the parents could not read the sacred writing, they signed with trembling hands, often believing their sons would serve in holy temples or be trained as priests, unaware of what truly awaited them behind palace walls. Once selected, the boys were taken immediately with no time for farewell or resistance. They were loaded into papyrus boats and sent upriver toward the capital. Temple records in Karnak describe this exchange as a sacred offering of beauty to the gods. But in reality, it was the beginning of a silent slavery, where these boys would be stripped of identity, dignity, and any chance at a normal life. They were transformed from sons into possessions inside the most powerful empire of the ancient world. The journey to the palace was silent, except for the sound of oars slicing through the Nile. As the boys arrived at the golden gates of Paramesu, or Wazit, depending on the dynasty and power, they were greeted not by kindness, but by handlers who viewed them as inventory rather than children. The moment they stepped onto the polished limestone floors, their old lives ended, as their names were erased, heads shaved, and plain linen clothes replaced with silk-like garments dyed with rare pigments and trimmed in gold thread, not to honor them, but to label them as owned. Inside massive stone halls, lit by oil lamps carved into the shape of falcons, they were assigned new names inspired by gods and stars, names that sounded poetic, but carried the weight of complete obedience. Every boy was assigned a senior attendant, often a former concubine himself, who began the process of transformation through ritual humiliation, strict routines, and psychological conditioning. Resistance was met by canes dipped in salt water, or hunger that lasted for days. Daily schedules were brutal, starting before sunrise with grooming and silence drills, followed by lessons in hieroglyphics, music, and sacred dances, meant to please not the gods, but the men who ruled Egypt. Any sign of homesickness was punished swiftly, for emotion was weakness, and weakness invited pain. The temple priests overseeing the training declared this suffering a purification, a cleansing of the soul before it could serve divine royalty. But for the boys, it was a slow erasure of everything they were, until they became reflections of what the palace wanted to see and nothing more. Inside the inner sanctums of the palace, far from the public eye, the boys underwent a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. As their bodies were trained to move with the elegance of temple dancers, their minds were filled with verses from the Book of the Dead and sacred texts of Thoth, not to enlighten them, but to refine them into perfect companions. Every day they practiced calligraphy with reed pens on papyrus, reciting lines in formal Middle Egyptian, while priests watched closely, noting who faltered or hesitated. Those who failed to meet the standard were sent to isolation chambers, where the only light came from oil lamps, and the only sound was their own breathing. Alongside academic learning, they were taught to play instruments like the lyre, the harp, and the double flute, for palace banquets where they would perform like living art. They learned to pour scented oils, mix perfumes, and apply kohl eyeliner with steady hands, so they would appear more divine than human. Each boy was expected to memorize the lineage of the pharaoh, the names of major gods, and the complex rituals of court etiquette, because any mistake in front of nobles could mean punishment or removal. Massage techniques, herbal treatments, and pressure point knowledge were also taught, not for healing, but for pleasure and obedience. At night they were drilled in posture, movement, and conversation, rehearsing laughter they did not feel, and compliments they did not mean, until their personalities became rehearsed scripts. Over time they stopped dreaming in their own voices, began answering to names that were never theirs, and believed silence was the only path to survival inside stone walls lined with gold and shadow. Life inside the palace was wrapped in silence and shadow, as the boys were housed in private chambers lined with alabaster floors and lotus carvings, with bronze mirrors and perfume bowls set neatly near the walls. But despite the luxury, their rooms were nothing more than cages, with barred windows and guards stationed outside who tracked every movement and interaction. Unlike household servants who had duties and schedules, male concubines were expected to remain in a constant state of readiness, polished, styled, and waiting for a summons that could come at dawn or deep into the night. They were told that obedience was beauty, and hesitation was disgrace, and so they moved through the palace with lowered eyes and rehearsed steps, trained to interpret the subtlest gestures from their masters. The atmosphere inside their wing was filled with tension, as older concubines manipulated the newer ones for status and favor, often stealing food or sabotaging performance rituals to rise higher in the invisible hierarchy. While some boys formed fragile friendships, most learned quickly that loyalty invited betrayal, and kindness often led to punishment. During palace feasts they were dressed in semi-transparent linen robes laced with gold dust, and ordered to entertain nobles with music, recitations, and quiet flirtation, while eunuchs watched silently from the shadows. Those who failed to impress were humiliated publicly, sometimes forced to kneel for hours or scrub floors while guests looked on. Every day they rehearsed politeness that felt like a performance of their own erasure, gradually forgetting how it felt to speak freely, or even think without fear, as the palace consumed not just their bodies, but their identities. In the golden cages of the palace, power was a cruel illusion, as those boys who became the pharaoh's favorites were granted luxuries that others could only dream of, such as rare honeyed wines, private baths laced with rose oil, and the softest linens brought from Nubian trade routes. But this favor came with a price, because with each gift came greater scrutiny, and rising jealousy from others who wished to replace them. The pharaoh's mood could shift with the wind, turning a night of laughter into a morning of silence, where once favored concubines found their rooms emptied and privileges stripped. Sometimes they were reassigned to temple labor, or vanished entirely without explanation. For those who failed to please, punishment was swift and theatrical, with some made examples of in front of other concubines, forced to stand motionless for hours beneath the sun, or ordered to kneel until their legs gave out. The cruelty was not always physical, because humiliation was the preferred weapon, and favorites who fell from grace often endured days of complete isolation. Meals reduced to dry bread and bitter water, with their names scrubbed from the morning recitation lists, as if they had never mattered. Yet despite this, every boy dreamed of becoming the next favorite, believing favor could become safety. But the truth was darker, because in the palace, the higher one rose, the harder the fall, and many who stood beside the pharaoh found themselves more terrified than the ones who waited in silence behind closed doors. Among the high columns of royal courts, and the carved reliefs of stone halls, history remembers the names of pharaohs, but not always the boys who stood silently behind their thrones. Yet records from the reign of Pharaoh Neferkare tell of one such favorite named Sasnet, a young temple-born boy whose beauty was described in priest scrolls as worthy of Ra himself. His closeness to the pharaoh became legend, as he accompanied the king not just in ceremonies, but in sacred rituals where only the divine were permitted. Neferkare granted him titles reserved for viziers, bestowed him with gold amulets, and even carved his name into offerings left at temple altars, which shocked and angered members of the court. Their relationship, though never fully written in explicit terms, was detailed in metaphors and poetic language within the Papyrus of Kahin, where it spoke of sleepless nights and divine unions beneath the stars. Yet as quickly as he rose, Sasnet vanished from the records after Neferkare's sudden death. Within days, palace scribes erased his name from public memory, his chambers sealed, his gifts confiscated, and rumors spread of exile or execution, though no official decree survives. Centuries later, tombs near Saqqara unearthed skeletons with twisted bones and broken ribs, believed by some to belong to forgotten favorites, discarded when their usefulness expired. Just like in other kingdoms, the favor of the ruler in Egypt brought not protection but danger. For when divine love fell from grace, it took everything with it, even the name carved in stone. Beneath the surface of obedience and luxury, the boys built invisible networks of survival, where spoken words were dangerous, but glances, touches, and nighttime whispers became lifelines. Those who had endured the palace for years began passing silent knowledge to the newly arrived, warning them about certain guards, certain attendants, and the shifting moods of the pharaoh, because in a world ruled by unpredictability, information was protection. These hidden alliances formed in shadows, behind statue-lined corridors, in the quiet moments after evening prayers, or during shared grooming routines, where conversations flowed through coded phrases and subtle gestures. Sometimes these connections grew deeper, evolving into secret companionships that offered not romance but comfort from isolation. As boys shared food, sneaked extra linen during winter nights, or quietly helped each other rehearse performances. Punishments became lighter when allies covered for one another, pretending not to notice trembling hands or forgotten lines. Although trust was a risk, many accepted it as the only way to stay human in a place designed to erase them. In rare moments, some concubines even planned escape, not from the palace, but from despair, by sharing scrolls stolen from scribes or praying together in forbidden corners. While most of these bonds were eventually broken by jealousy, fear, or reassignment, a few lasted long enough to leave memories carved in broken furniture, or hidden under floor tiles, where scratched names told stories of boys who had nothing left but each other. Even when they were forced apart, the echo of that quiet defiance stayed alive, like a flicker of light behind the cold walls of stone. As Egypt began to change with the arrival of foreign powers, shifting dynasties, and new religious ideologies, the tradition of keeping male concubines slowly faded from the palaces, though not from memory. While the gods may have changed, and temples fell to sand, the boys remained behind in the shadows, forgotten but not gone. During the reign of the later Ptolemies, Hellenistic values clashed with older Egyptian customs, leading to the quiet dismissal of many concubines, whose masters feared scandal or loss of favor with Rome. As these boys aged out of desirability, with skin weathered and voices no longer soft, they were cast aside with no skill to survive in the outside world. Many found themselves begging in temple markets, or sweeping floors in the very places they once performed in silk and gold. Some wandered into the desert, dying nameless and alone, their past erased by a society eager to modernize, but unwilling to admit its cruelty. A few temple scrolls, recovered from hidden chambers in Abydos, mention decrees to clear concubine quarters and silence gossip, yet offer no aid to the displaced. While new rulers outlawed certain practices, the enforcement was selective, and the suffering continued behind closed doors, in merchant homes and remote estates, where power still bought silence and beauty. No one dared to ask what became of the last generation of boys trained to please, but never to live freely. Like the worn statues buried beneath shifting sands, their stories faded not because they were untrue, but because too many wanted to forget. Modern Egypt does not speak of them, and history books often pass over their existence with silence or shame. The truth of what these boys endured beneath golden ceilings and painted gods remains carved in the stones, and buried in the sands for those who dare to look. Their stories are not legends or myths, but painful reminders that cruelty can wear the mask of beauty, and that power, when left unchecked, can turn human lives into decorations. Though the temples are ruins and the pharaohs dust, the systems that allowed such exploitation still exist in new forms, hidden behind modern laws and polished facades. Today, around the world, boys are still trafficked, trained, and sold under names like labor, entertainment, or servitude, proving that time does not erase injustice. It only teaches it to adapt. Those boys of ancient Egypt, with their painted eyes and broken names, deserve to be remembered not as curiosities or shadows, but as human beings whose lives were stolen in the name of glory and silence. If we forget them, we risk repeating the same sins behind different doors, and so their memory must live not in textbooks or scrolls, but in our refusal to look away when power demands obedience, and innocence is treated as a transaction. Dignity is not bound by time or culture. It is a birthright, and when it is denied, it must be spoken for, no matter how long the silence has lasted.